The first knock came at 2:13 a.m. Claire was awake, watching the red sweep of the lighthouse light drag across the ceiling like a slow saw blade. The cottage had that old coast smell, salt and damp wood, seaweed and oil, and even with the heat turned up, it never truly warmed. In the quiet, the knock sounded like a knuckle on a door, twice, measured, deliberate. She held her breath and listened for footsteps on her porch. There was only the slow hiss of the wind through the dune grass and the white noise of the tide beyond the dark road. The second night, the knock came again at 2:13. She checked her phone after, half expecting to see that number. When she opened the blinds, the fog was so thick the road disappeared, the world cut down to a smear of grey. Far out at the headland, the lighthouse beam disappeared and reappeared with each revolution, its lens eye blinking. By the third night, Claire was waiting for it. She sat at the little kitchen table with her uncle's journal open in front of her and a mug of black tea cooling between her hands. The last pages were filled with erratic handwriting, scratched and crowded like the words were trying to climb out of the paper. Voices in the fog, lights that call, the sea remembers. He had underlined that last line 3 times. In the margins, he'd drawn tiny lighthouses, spirals of light with eyes at their centers. The knock, 2 beats, came at 2:13 again. The cottage's thin walls seemed to thrum with it. She stood up and edged to the door, her socked feet silent on the cold floorboards. When she opened it, the fog blew in around her ankles like smoke. The road was empty. A damp chill crept up under her coat. Somewhere down the slope where the shore broke into rock and tidder pools, a buoy bell rang, distant and sorrowful. The knock sounded again, but this time it was fainter, as if coming from the shore itself. "Hello," she called. "Is someone out there?" Her breath hung in front of her in a pale ribbon. The fog swallowed her voice. The locals had told her in that reserved, weather-beaten way that her uncle had gone out on a foggy night in late October and never come back. "Went walking, that's all," the woman at the general store had said, bagging Claire's coffee and eggs like she was handling driftwood. "Storm came quick. Tides are tricky off that point. Best keep outer the lighthouse after dusk." She'd said the last part as if it were an old rule, like not whistling on a boat or not naming a pig you meant to slaughter. Claire had laughed it off then. Now, standing in her doorway with the cold creeping into her bones and the foghorn bellowing like a sleeping animal, she felt suddenly like the cottage had been placed at the edge of the world as a dare. The journal's earlier pages were ordinary, mundane entries about repairs, the price of diesel, the names of neighbors who helped him lug a new stove in. Then, in mid-September, the tone shifted. He wrote about an old man who'd been lighthouse keeper decades before automation made that job obsolete. The old man told him that in heavy fog the lantern sometimes lit without electricity, and that you could hear the voices of the lost, if you were patient enough, if you were quiet. Her uncle had found that funny at first. His notes became observations: fog density, light behavior, reports of strange flares seen by teenage boys on the seawall after midnight. In late October, the notes turned to pleas. The last entry, dated October 29th, said only 2:13. "I think it's her." Claire closed the journal and pressed the heel of her hand to her chest, a little embarrassed by how hard her heart was thudding. Her aunt had died years ago. He couldn't have meant her, unless he'd been talking about the sea the way old men did, giving it a pronoun and a mood, as if it woke and slept and judged. On the 4th night, she brought a flashlight and walked down from the cottage after midnight while the fog lay heavy as wool. The gravel road became packed dirt, then turned to a track through beech rose and scrub pine. The thorns caught her jeans with a sound like whispering. She kept to the center, and the beam of her light stayed tight, grey with moisture. Beyond the pines the ground fell away, and the rocks opened like broken teeth. The lighthouse stood on the farthest jaw of cliff, its white paint weathered to bone, its narrow windows dark. When the lamp swung past, the lens threw a thin sheet of light through the fog, a slow blade turning. Claire had never thought of light as a thing that could cut, but here it seemed to. Her phone read 2:12. She shut off the flashlight to let her eyes adjust. The fog held her in, close and intimate. She could smell iodine and rot and engine oil. She counted the seconds. 63, 64, 65. The knock came from the rocks below her, or the water beyond, or from the light itself. She couldn't tell. It was that same cadence, 2 measured taps. It sounded like knuckles against hollow wood. The hair rose along her arms. "Uncle Mark," she said before she could stop herself, and the name felt foolish in that enormous blankness. Her voice went out and seemed to fall. She switched the flashlight back on, and the beam caught on a shape near the nearest tidderpool, a lobster pot, old and silvered, half buried in rockweed. For a sick moment she thought she'd see a shoe, a coat caught in rope, a hand. There was only seaweed moving like hair. The pot shifted with the swell, tap, tap, as a line pulled taut and eased. She laughed, too loud. That was it, then. The knock was just the tides toying with garbage. She watched for a minute more. The pot moved a little, and there were the 2 taps, neat as a drum practice. The sound timed itself on her phone while she watched, the press of numbers at 2:13 a.m. She said it out loud, scoffing at herself, letting the rational explanation wash through her. The foghorn gave a long low moan like a cow, and the sigh of relief trembled in her throat as a shiver. The rationality held until she started back up the path and saw the other lights. They were not steady like the lighthouse's rotation, or arbitrary like the wharf lamps. They kept to the fog, little nicked stars that swarmed and paused and swarmed again. They looked like someone was walking through the mist with a handful of electrical sparks, letting them escape one at a time. Claire froze. She forced herself to count. The old scientist in her, the one from grad school, before her uncle's sudden inheritance had knocked her life off its rail, insisted on counting, on naming. 7, then 3, then 11. They moved toward the lighthouse and then stopped as one, as if waiting, and a beat later the lighthouse's beam slid by and the smaller lights woke and chased its tail like schooling fish. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." She told herself she was seeing trucks' headlights broken by the mist and refracted. She told herself the fog itself had eyes when it caught and held light. She told herself it was teenage boys on the seawall with LEDs on sticks, and she would go into town and ask, and they would roll their eyes at city folk, and she would feel sheepish and then sell the cottage in the spring and leave this place to its ghosts and its beer and its old men. Back at the cottage, there were 2 wet footprints on the porch she did not remember making. Bare, both of them, the toes splayed, too close together to be hers. She stood and stared, heart beating off rhythm, then took a paper towel and wiped them clean like she could erase the thought. She slept badly and woke to gulls screaming. The footprints were gone, and so was her certainty. She carried the journal to the couch and read the late entries 3 times. Her uncle had gotten hung up on 2:13. He'd logged every night it happened for 2 weeks. The 2 knocks came each time without fail, and sometimes after that came a voice. He never wrote what it said. He switched to fog density in the next paragraph, a bewildering gait change, as if he had had to step away from something in his own head. The last line, "I think it's her," lingered like a salt on her tongue. In town, she asked at the bait shop because it felt like a place where men told truths about matters of tide and luck. The owner shook herring into a bin for a waiting fisherman and said without looking at her, "Best to keep to your stove when it's thick out there. Don't go chasing will-o'-wisps." Is that what they are? What else would they be? When she didn't answer, he glanced up and softened just enough to be human. "You don't got to follow every light, miss." "I'm not," she lied, then bought a coil of thin nylon line and a new flashlight battery she didn't need. The next fog came 2 nights later, and it came fast, mid-afternoon, a bank rolling over the water to the town, salt-white, swallowing gulls in a handful. By dusk the houses were islands, and the streetlights put out pale halos that didn't reach the nearest fence posts. Claire ate a can of soup she could taste the tin in and watched the beam of the lighthouse paint the ceiling. She tried to read. At 2:10 she put on her boots. At 2:12 she was on the path, the fog wetting her hair and her eyelashes. At 2:13 the knock came from somewhere ahead and below, and she felt it in her ribs. "Mark," she said, and the fog answered as always with its lack of answer. But then, not from out near the Tidderpools, not from below, she heard her name. "Claire," it said, and she knew the shape of it. She knew it like a childhood phrase. The voice was thin as videotape audio, worn on the edges, but alive. It came from above, from the lighthouse. She told herself it was only wind traveling up the stairs. She told herself some fisherman on his VHF had a daughter named Claire. She told herself the world did this, the world of sea and fog and men in boots rid of mercy, that it put your thoughts into your ears and dared you to call it superstition. She went. The lighthouse door had never been locked as long as she could remember. The paint on it had bubbled and flaked so much it felt like the skin of a boiled egg. Inside, the air held a sour metallic smell, and her beam hit the spiral stairs and turned them into a coil. Her boots clanged on the metal. She started up, one hand on the cold rail, one holding the flashlight. The foghorn moaned, and she felt it through her ribs and spine. Halfway up she stopped because she heard the 2 knocks again. Inside, now, 2 floors above, as if some polite thing was asking permission to enter a room it already owned. "Claire," the voice said again, so quiet, so near. She went up. The stairs ended at a heavy hatch and a short ladder to the lantern room. She pushed, and it gave with a groan. The lantern room was a glass cage, the massive Fresnel lens taking up most of the space like a siege engine, its prisms knifing all sight into slices. The lamp rotated with an old slow patience, and Claire's reflection flickered between the lenses, a woman in a grey coat with damp hair and salt on her lips, repeating, repeating, repeating. For a moment she thought there was someone else in the room, a man as slick and pale as a seal, his eyes reflecting light like an animal's. Then he was gone, a trick of lenses. Her light moved and caught something small and stubborn in the far corner behind the lamp's housing, a tangle of wire and mirrors. No, not mirrors exactly. Glass shards from bottles, polished by sand, chips of sea glass green and brown and clear, wired onto a frame that looked like it used to be a crab pot. The frame was bolted to the floor. The wires ran to a car battery. A second coil of wire led from the battery to a little weather radio propped on an upturned bucket. She bent to it like a supplicant. Her breath fogged the glass in front of her. She saw the radios at a glow, dim and steady. Another little box, a cheap digital timer, sat beside it, its numbers blinking. The screen said 2:12. The seconds rolled to 2:13 and the little box clicked, and the radio hissed to life. From its tiny speaker came 2 quick taps, like knuckles on wood. Claire crouched and stared at the device until her eyes watered. The fog and the sea and the dead had nothing to do with it. It was a trick. It was a thing built to make a sound at an hour. Her uncle had built it, or someone had built it for him, or some kid a generation before had wired it up for a lark. The relief came like a lame dog, grateful and embarrassed to be in the room. She laughed, actually laughed, and the sound bounced around the lens and returned to her in fragments. The radio hissed again, and then the voice said, "Claire." She did not move. "You shouldn't have come," it said in her uncle's tone, one he used when he had a beer in him and wanted to be dramatic. Then, more softly, Good kid. She crawled the last foot on her knees and looked at the radio like it might bite. She pressed her ear to it. "Mark," she whispered, and then louder, demanding, "Mark." The radio hissed. She twisted the volume. She banged a knuckle against the plastic. She scanned. It was set to weather, and the little screen showed the channel. The voice said her name again, but longer, like a rope being paid out. Then there was another knock, more distant, as if beneath the floor. "Who did this?" she asked the room. "Who set this up?" The lighthouse answered by turning. The lens's prisms sliced the fog outside into panes of grey. Through the glass she glimpsed the other lights, gathered in a small cloud at the edge of the catwalk, and for a second she saw that they were not torches or cars or handheld LEDs. They were organisms. She could not say how she knew it, only that the knowledge came like cold water. Little living flares, swarming to the lamplight as if to a mother. A wave hit the rocks hard enough for the shock to climb the lighthouse's bones and into her teeth. "Claire," the radio said, "listen." The voice was not right. It had the rhythm of his speech, but none of the breath, like a photograph of a sentence. "Who recorded you?" she begged. "What do you want me to hear?" The radio spat a string of numbers. Her uncle had loved numbers, coordinates, water temperatures, storm categories. He said them now, slow and careful, and she wrote them on her wrist with a pen she kept in her coat sleeve. The coordinates were familiar in a way that made her nauseated. She pictured the mouth of the cove where the tides hit each other and grind. She pictured the flat slab of rock where locals filleted mackerel. She pictured a boat someone once tied off badly. She pictured him standing in this room with wires in his hands and glass between his teeth, determined to make something meaningful out of noise. "Okay," she said. "Okay, I'll go." The radio stuttered and went silent. The timer's LED blinked, blind, content. She wanted to smash it. She wanted to hold it to her chest like a phone call from a war. Instead, she unplugged nothing and went back down the stairs, each step louder than the last. Outside, the fog had thickened until the catwalk rail felt like the last real thing in the world. Claire kept a hand on it and moved around the tower. The lights in the fog clustered, and she swore she could hear them, a tiny dry sound like moths. They were lovely and wrong, like rosary beads made of fish eyes. She found the metal steps down to the rocks and went carefully. The sea made noises she had no names for. She picked her way across kelp slick as organs. The GPS on her phone showed her a dot, and she moved the dot toward the numbers on her wrist. When she got there was nothing. She swept the beam of the flashlight around, and the rocks threw her light back in pieces. The water surged. She felt the pull of it in her ankles, though it did not yet touch her. "Mark!" she shouted, and her voice snapped as if the fog had broken it. The other lights pressed close, hovering at the edges of her sight until she looked straight at them, and then they slid away like eels. She thought of fishermen's stories, cold fires in the wake, the way scallop shells shine at night when you rub them, the summer the bay lit blue when you kicked it. She told herself these were plankton, disturbed by the light. She told herself the same story again and again, a rosary of reason. Something knocked against her boot. She looked down. A length of nylon line had looped itself around her ankle in the water and tugged. She bent to free it and felt it tighten. The ocean took a breath. She flung herself backward, scrambling, and skinned both palms on barnacles. The line pulled again, stronger, as if the tide itself had hands. "Stop," she told it, which was ridiculous, and then laughed in panic at herself and kicked, yanking her ankle free, slicing it on the rock. Blood folded into the water in a lazy feather. The lights swarmed and dimmed like something feeding. "Okay," she said, to the fog, to the lights, to herself. Okay. She backed up the rock until her shoulders hit the lighthouse's foundation. She pulled her leg up and examined the cut. It bled fast and then slower. She wrapped it in her scarf and pressed. When she looked up, the fog thinned just enough for the shape of the cove across to show itself, and on the far side she saw the silhouette of a small boat, sitting wrong on the water, her uncle's skiff. It should not have been there. It had been hauled up beside the cottage and sat like a cradle for months, but the shape was right, the tilt familiar. The lights swam under it in a chain. She blinked, and it was gone. She sat until the foghorn spoke again and again, and then the real fog, the dawn fog, came, a softer thing, and the lighthouse's beam dulled with it. She limped back to the cottage in the grey light, feeling like a child who had run too far and gotten lost, and then found her street, only to realize her house was other, slightly other, as if moved by hand. Later that day she returned with a pair of wire cutters and a toolbox. The fog had burned off, and the sky was brittle blue. Gulls coasted and screamed. The lighthouse looked foolish in daylight, a relic. Inside the lantern room, the glass lashings and radio and timer sat like a nest no creature claimed. She crouched before them. She meant to cut the wires, to heft the battery and drop it, to end the ritual. Instead she hesitated, a coward. The device was someone's devotion. Smashing it felt like looking away from a person drowning. She did nothing that day. She went home and washed her hands and changed her bandage. That night at 2:13, the knocks came as always, and then the voice, low and careful. Listen. She wrote down another set of numbers. The next night, one more. 3 nights, 3 coordinates. She plotted them on her phone, and they made a triangle around a patch of water just outside the cove, a patch known as Breaker's Thumb because the waves there stood up in a hand shape when the tide fought a northerly wind. She thought of cold mornings with her uncle driving her there when she was small, pointing to the thumb, telling her every bit of this coast had a name. On the 4th night, there were no knocks. The silence at 2:13 was a kind of knocking in reverse. She lay awake and hated herself for missing the sound. At 2:19, the voice came instead. The pain, it said, the word clipped. Pain. She went to the lighthouse at noon with a roll of paper towels, a bottle of cleaner, and a hammer. The lantern room had a corner where one glass pane was clouded, a mildew pallor that had crept in past a failed seal. She cleaned it until her shoulders ached, the rag coming away black-green, the glass clearing. She stood in the center and turned slowly, watching the town appear and disappear in the lens like a film. She lifted the hammer then, for no reason she could say, and tapped the pane once lightly. The sound in the room was bright as a bell. A thin crack ran from the corner of the glass like a vein. "No," she said out loud, the anger like a sudden heat, and she pressed the heel of her hand to the crack like she could hold it together. It would need replacing. It would be expensive. The town would not pay, not for a lighthouse no one manned except ghosts. She thought of her uncle's pension in its dull little island of numbers. She imagined him here with epoxy and tape, nursing the pain like a pet, insisting he could mend it on his own. "Pain," the radio said softly behind her, though she had not turned it on, though the timer should have been asleep. "Pain," it said the second time, and the vowel bent. The word changed in her mouth. She stood very still. She ended it that night. She went up after dark and cut the wires with the cutters and pulled the battery's lead and left it dead. She took the radio under her coat like a stolen thing and brought it home. She put it in the bottom drawer of the kitchen and closed it and sat on the floor with her back against the cabinet like a guard dog. The knocks came at 2:13 anyway. They were softer, as if ashamed, as if they had been told to wait in the car. She lay awake until dawn and then slept an hour and dreamed of glass breaking in tall grass. She might have left the next day, might have packed boxes, called a realtor, gotten on the interstate until the salt eased from the car and the air stopped sticking to her throat. Instead, she called the harbor master and asked about Breaker's Thumb. He said the bottom there was a treacherous shelf and the currents odd, and on some mornings you could see big rips run out like ropes. "Anything down there?" she asked. "Old wrecks, that kind of thing?" "A few," he said. "People drop more than they mean to. Lobster pots, anchors, names. You know." "I don't," she said, and he laughed once and hung up. She walked the beach until her cut reopened and bled through her sock. She passed an old man with a dog. He tipped his cap. Old habits surviving men. "Afternoon," he said, and then, as if they were continuing a conversation he'd been having with her uncle for years, "No use looking when the sea don't want to give." "I'm not looking," she lied. He pointed toward the lighthouse with his chin. "She'll call and call till you answer. That's her trick. She's lonelier than God." "I thought it was a will-o'-the-wisp," she said. He smiled, or the wind moved his face, and then he went on. The dog lifted its feet high, unhappy in the kelp. That night the fog came out of nowhere around 9, and she fell asleep early on the couch with her coat on and woke at 1:57 with the silence pressing. The radio in the drawer had turned itself on like old toys do in horror movies, and she hated that she thought that. She opened the drawer, and the radio's green LED winked. She took it to the table and set it down. The kitchen clock said 2:12. She waited. The radio hissed. The voice said the coordinates again, patient, like teaching a child to tie shoes. She whispered them with him, as if that would summon something other than more fog. "Mark," she said, and through the wall of fog, from the direction of Breaker's Thumb, there came not a knock but a thud, heavy as a shoulder against a door. Claire flinched. The cottage windows shuddered. She thought of the skiff on the far side of the cove, wrong on the water, then gone. She went one last time, barefoot in her boots, coat over pajamas, the flashlight beam thin as a reed. The path grew a second path beside it, narrow and black like someone had walked this walk 1,000 times in the dark. She took that one without meaning to. Down at the rocks the tide was low and the pools gleamed like eyes. The lights swam beneath the surface, an underwater sky. She stood at the mouth of the cove and said, "I'm here," and it was a kind of relieving defeat, like kneeling to tie a shoe and not getting up again. He stepped out of the fog. She knew it was her uncle because she knew his silhouette, the slope of his shoulders, the way he kept his hands loose at his sides as if ready to catch something. A football, a conversation, a grief. He stood where the tide would take the next step, and he did not sink. He was either very close or very far away. The light from the lighthouse turned and found the planes of his face and moved on. "Claire," he said, and the sound was not from the radio, and that was worse. "You're dead," she said softly, and the fog folded it like cloth. He smiled a little. It was both him and not, like seeing him in a window of a moving train. "Depends on who you ask," he said. "Did you build it?" She gestured blindly at the tower. "The thing with the glass and the radio." He looked up at the light, and she did too, because you could not. The beam carved through something invisible, and the invisible bled green from all the little glass shards. "I thought I did," he said. "What does that mean?" "I wired it," he said, as if that were a compliment. "But it was already here." He looked at her and then past her, at the cottage on the hill. "You shouldn't have come. You called." He expelled a breath that might have been a laugh. "I called lots of people." "I heard," she said. "The boys on the seawall. Teenage boys hear everything," he said, and smiled for real then. The wave at his ankles did not move him. The little lights swam up to his boot and winked out one by one, like they had touched a hot wire. "What do you want?" she asked. "The pane," he said. "I cleaned it," she said stupidly. "Break it," he said, not gentle now. "Break it until it doesn't call." She stared at him. "It calls." He nodded. "It called me that night. It calls like the first time you heard your name." "How is it a pain?" she began, and then stopped. He was looking at her with patient love, the way he had when she was little, and asking how rain works, how boats float, how you know when a story is over. "I thought it was a light to keep things off rocks," he said. "Turns out it's something else, too." He glanced down at his boots, and the wave went around them like a dog. "You can't tell the town. From here," he said, lifting his chin at the world, "they'll laugh. From there," and he pointed at her heart with the smallest movement of his chin, "you can do what you need. What happens if I don't? They keep coming." He did not have to say who. She felt in her chest the intake of the sea before it smashes. "Are you—" she could not finish. "Alive? Saved?" He spread his hands. The lighthouse swung its one-eyed gaze back. When the light hit him, the mesh of him showed. Not skin, not bone, but something like the reflections inside the lens, layer upon layer of shape. When the light passed, he was just a man in a coat looking at his niece with fatigue. "Please," he said, and now he sounded like the last entry in a notebook. She went back up the tower while the fog lay on the rocks like a hand. She didn't run. The stairs would punish that. In the lantern room, she stood absolutely still in the slow-moving light and put her palm on the pane that had cracked under her hammer. She felt the scene, the water and the rocks and the town, as heat. The glass was warm where the others were cold. At 2:13 the room hummed, and it was not the battery or the timer or the radio. It was the world. It sounded like this sentence will cost you everything. She lifted the hammer. There has always been a debate about how things break, whether the first crack is the true act and the rest is just consequence, or whether the 8th, the 12th, the last is the only one that matters because it's the one that makes the thing stop being what it was. Clair swung, and the first hit spidered the pane. The second took out a triangle. The third sent a sliver singing to the floor like a high note. The lens was so close she had to aim carefully. She did not want to scar the machine that kept boats off the rocks. The pane gave up finally with a sound like a sob. The wind came through the hole like a word finally spoken. The light turned, and for a moment the room teemed with those small lights from the fog, called in. They patted against her wrist, her cheek, her mouth, and she tasted salt that was not salt. She stepped back and swung again until the hole was ugly and honest, and rain would come in, and someone from town would have to come and say goddamn and fix it. The radio downstairs in the drawer went quiet. The fog lifted over the next hour the way a fever breaks. The first gull made a single sound like a question. The lighthouse's beam died in the sun. Claire stood on the catwalk and looked down at the rocks and saw that the lights had gone. The tide was coming in. The area around Breaker's Thumb was just water again, flat as a coin. She did not look for him on the rocks. She climbed down and walked the path to the cottage, and made coffee and drank it with her hands around the mug, as if she were learning what warmth was. She took the radio from the drawer and put it on the table and waited. It gave her the weather forecast in a man's professional tone she did not know. At 2:13 it was only a clock. At noon the harbour-master called because she had put in an inquiry earlier, and he was thorough. He said a diver he knew owed him a favour, and had gone down at Breaker's Thumb that morning because there'd been a stretch of dead calm after fog, rare as hen's teeth. The diver had found a tangle of old line and a dented outboard engine. He'd also found a metal plate with a boat registration number still readable if you squinted. The number matched one from a skiff that had gone missing a year back. The diver sent a photo, and it matched the dent under her uncle's gunwale from the time he hit a dock pile in a hurry. "We'll have to report it," the harbour master said gently. "Of course," Claire said. "You want us to bring it up?" "No," she said. "Leave it where it is." It surprised her to hear herself say it. He loved it there. That sounded insane. The harbour master did not argue, because the world allows a certain amount of insanity for grief when there's paperwork attached. The town did not laugh about the pain. They came out with a truck and a glass plate and remarks about salt and seals, and how anyone could see that old frame needed a better seal. No one mentioned a call. No one looked at her like she was a witch. The new pane went in with a pop like a joint settling. The men wiped their hands and left. That night she slept through 2:13, and when she woke, the first thought that came to her was not of fog but of the sound of waves under ice. The cottage made its small noises. Something in the rafters shuffled like little feet. She lay there waiting for the knock that did not come and did not know whether she was disappointed or saved. A week later, a storm came in wild, and the lighthouse went dark for 6 hours because something had tripped somewhere. A wire, a transformer. No boats went out. No lights showed in the fog but the town's. Kids on the seawall complained. A man at the bar said the place felt wrong with the eye shut. In the morning, the lamp woke and swept, and the pane shone, clean and new and anonymous. Claire went up and stood in the room and put her palm on it and felt nothing but her own heat. Before she left in spring, she carried her uncle's journal back up to the lantern room and set it on the floor near the base of the lens. It was ridiculous, but it felt like the place it needed to live. She ran her fingers over the lines of the last entry, "I think it's her," and said, "It wasn't," and also, "But thank you." On her last night in the cottage, she woke at 2:13 anyway, as if the sea had wound a little spring in her blood. She lay and listened to the fog's slow breath. Somewhere far away, a loose buoy knocked twice. It could have been anything. It could have been everything. She counted slowly to 100 and did not move. In town the next morning, the old man with the dog tipped his cap again. "Headed out." "Yeah," she said. "Someone else can have the pain." He chuckled. "Always someone," he said. On the drive south, the fog lifted after the third bridge. The land unfolded, green, complicated, ordinary. Hours later, stopped at a light 2 states away, she thought she saw in the corner of the intersection a shimmer, the way heat makes roads quiver, and felt one anchor loosen in her chest. It was sunshine on a windshield. It was a trick of eyes. She did not look back. When she reached her apartment, she unpacked slowly. The radio went on a shelf near the window. It gave her 10-day forecasts and thunderstorm warnings. At night, in a city full of busy lights that meant nothing, she slept. On the third night home she woke out of a dream of a catwalk to the sound of 2 quick knocks, as if someone had rapped softly on the inside of her chest, and lay with her hand over her sternum, waiting, the fog of a far place still cool in her lungs. After a long minute she smiled into the dark at how stupid love can make you, how faithful. She waited a second minute, and then she slept. The lighthouse remains. The pane shines. On certain late autumn nights when the mist comes down and the gulls go silent and the foghorn's voice gets into the bones of the town, someone hears 2 knocks at 2:13 and thinks about getting up. Whether they do or not is not a matter of superstition but of story. The one you're in, the one you refuse, the one that calls you by name until you answer.